So in today's webinar, we're going to talk about all the different ways I typically see teams of coders interacting with each other, collaborating, sharing coded information with each other between files. Let me bring this back up since I just started the recording.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, making a video portfolio, like finding exemplar instances or snippets of video and creating a video portfolio, aggregating movies together, like if you have a large data set or any size data set that you want to sort of take a cumulative look, we call across the whole data set, we call that combined timelines. There's a new feature in version 10, which is you are able to save multiple timelines inside one movie package. If you're working on teams, that's usually very helpful. And also sending timeline information between coders on a team without having to send the whole movie package. That's the fourth bullet there with XML edit list in parentheses. And then we can talk a little bit about common sharing platforms with video, because there's various strategies on how to actually share the actual files with each other. So yeah, like usual, feel free to stop and ask a question at any time.
Okay.
Let's minimize or get rid of this for a second. So the first thing I was going to demonstrate is called databasing. And I have two movie packages open here. You can see they're different movies. If you look at the movie window, they're different intersections. You're probably familiar with these from other tutorials. But databasing, the idea with databasing is that I just want to take a handful of clips and create, like in my mind, a video portfolio. Maybe that's for purposes of sort of creating a discrete data set, that looks at a particular participant in the video, or maybe certain locations or things like that. So the basic idea is I could select, before I move on, let me point out the fact that you can see the row names in each timeline are almost the same, with a little difference in that one has row 7 called skateboarder, and this one has, let's move this down here just to make it a little more obvious, pedestrian and bicycle. But other than that, they're exactly the same. So the idea here is I'm going to close actually intersection 2 for the time being, and let's just say this taxi instance is a great example of a taxi doing something, and this first pedestrian, and maybe this one bicycle, and then I'm going to take one instance down here. You can really select any amount, right? I could do Command A, I could select one row, I could just select a certain range like this, but for sake of our example, let me just actually select a couple instances here. And there we go. So the idea here is that I want to take these handful of clips because they're great examples and sort of, segregate them into their own video portfolio. So once they're selected, I'll click on the database icon on the timeline. And this window is just asking me, hey, you selected some clips. Where do you want to put those? We want to put them into what we call a database, but we haven't created that database yet. So right here is where we can create the new standalone database. This is the option you typically want to choose. And this is the name of the database. So I'm just going to call this like best instances. And let me pay attention to where I'm saving it. I'm going to put it on the desktop. So this is going to be my best instances database. I'm going to click save. And then you just get a little message that it's going to use up a little more space. So I'll click yes. Give it a second. And then it says the database has been updated. So you can see maybe that it took just these instances that we selected in the timeline down here and moved them into their own timeline. So actually their own movie package. So everything you know about a regular movie package is exactly the same here. So you know how to watch an instance. I could double click there and open it up in its own window, right? I could watch a row of instances by double clicking on the name of the row. But basically all those things, all those features are the same from a regular movie package to a database, because really a database is just another movie package. So you can see that the instances actually look a little longer. Actually, they look a lot longer, right? Compared to down here. Like this first instance that I selected is the first instance here. They just look longer because the timeline is actually shorter, right? Anytime that wasn't coded, which is like, I only chose a handful of clips in the beginning. All this stuff in terms of the timeline is not exported to the database. It's just the specific clips that you want. So that's why it becomes like a video portfolio, and that you're just sort of isolating these really meaningful moments for you. You kind of lose the flow of the actual event though, right?
But then it allows you to focus on these particular instances.
Exactly.
Like
right.
I'm actually thinking, I mean, I just came from a meeting where we were discussing what do we do with instances where students talk simultaneously and the teacher does not have a chance to respond to each student, and the teacher responds at the end. And we were talking about the need for us to kind of look at those instances and see whether they're really different. So actually, this might be something that I might do, just to track down those instances and then just have a video of them, and then just be able just to analyze those instances by themselves in a video, in what you're now calling. So this will be like my portfolio. So it will be my portfolio of instances where students talk simultaneously and the teacher does not have a chance to respond to each of them.
Yeah, that's probably a good use case for this. Yeah, anytime if that subset is still going to be part of your main or primary data set, I might encourage you to keep it in the same timeline. But yeah, that's probably a good use case for it.
Okay.
So that's the basic idea with databasing, is you're really just grabbing a handful of clips from any timeline and dumping it into this, what we call a database. So let me now point out that I'm going to close the initial intersection one. Let me close the database. I'm going to open intersection 2. Remember, this is a different movie, but it has some of the same named rows. That makes sense. So let me just grab a couple instances there, and I'm going to take this one skateboarder clip. So we have some instances from the same named rows and one instance from a different row, differently named row. I'll click on the database here. And then in this case, I don't need to click new standalone because we already have a database, right? So I can just choose to dump those into my best instances database, click export. And again, I'll get this little message that it's going to take some extra space. So you can see the database open there on the screen, and it has the existing instances from our first export, right? Now, if I click yes, so let me point out, notice in row 1, taxi row, there's 2 instances. So when I click yes, it's going to take that one instance I took from from the second movie package, intersection 2, and dump it or append it into the same row based on that row name. Does that make sense?
That makes sense.
So let's close this guy and leave open just the database. So you might imagine now, if you ended up databasing, these clips from any individual movie packages into a database, the database just sort of auto organizes and sorts all the clips into the corresponding rows, right? So if you pay attention to the row names, this will set you up for a neatly organized database, right? Like and this is where you can see the video turns. Can you see, if you look at the video window, you see intersection 1, and then at this point it switches over to intersection 2, and you could just keep appending into the same database. And for these rows, like skateboarder, right, it makes sense there's only one instance way at the end because there weren't any instances from the first movie.
Okay, so this allows you actually to collect instances from more than one, from different timelines and put together. Okay.
And this is one way. And it's really typically more used for this sort of video portfolio idea, or like a separate, very discrete data set. Mostly for viewing purposes, I would say, not necessarily for analysis purposes. I know at certain institutions, students are filming themselves, giving a lesson plan over many lessons over, let's say, a semester, and then they record themselves, they code them in the individual databases, the individual movie packages, and then just find maybe their best clips to make a database of their best clips from the semester. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's called databasing. A different, to switch features here now, a different feature to aggregate or dump clips from many different movie packages into a single one is called combined timeline movies. So we'll cover that right now. Again, I'll use this intersection 1, intersection 2. So the idea here now is that I want, instead of taking just a handful of instances, let's say I want to take a cumulative look at all my individual movie packages, right? That's what combined timelines is used for. So if I go to, in Studiocode, if I go to File, Combine Timeline Movies, that's a specific feature for us. Combine timeline movies. You might hear me call it, or hear us call it, combined timelines. That's just sort of the more common name we use. So if I do that, I choose that, this window pops up and it just says, hey, what movie packages do you want to aggregate or stitch together? And in this case, let's say I just want to select these two. I could select them here. I could select a folder and it would choose all the movie packages in a folder as well. But for right now, I'll just select these two and I'll click Add to Selection. And then you can see that they get added to this window. This is the place now where you could rearrange the order here. And the order here, in terms of top to bottom, affects the way the unified timeline is constructed from left to right. That'll make more sense in a second. But for right now, let's just, it makes sense for me chronologically to go intersection 1, then intersection 2. I'll hit Combine. And so this says, we're going to create this combined timeline. And yeah, maybe I'll just leave it called Combined Timeline for now. And I'll save it to the desktop. Let's hit Save. Okay, so here's the combined timeline over my desktop, right? Looks like a movie package, and it works like a movie package for the most part. Let me minimize that. But now you can see that it took the entire timeline and all the coding, right? From intersection 1, and then, I don't know, 2/3 of the way through or halfway through, there's where it switches to intersection 2. Does that make sense?
Okay, so it doesn't. So what it does, it's kinds of combines them linearly, like you have the first one and then the second one.
Exactly. That's a great word.
Okay, so it doesn't put the instances in between. No. Okay, so you have the first one, then okay, that makes sense. Okay.
And similarly to the database, right? It took all the taxi instances, in this case, just for example, and dumped them into the same row based on those row names. Yes. Now, if I wanted to see all the taxi clips from both movie packages, it's really easy for me to just double click on that row name. And then, there's hundreds of instances in here, but just took a second. And now I can watch one movie, right? With all my clips in one place.
Oh.
Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. That makes sense.
So I think typically, especially for education researchers, this is a very common tool to use in terms of taking a more cumulative look at your entire data set or certain portions of it. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. It makes sense because I'm thinking if I'm interested in a particular maybe code like taxi or whatever it is, then I have a chance of looking across all the timelines. Well, maybe 2 or 3 or whatever. Is there a limit really?
Yeah, I mean, good question. There is a limit in terms of how many videos you can combine because it's not really a limit of studio code per se. It's just at some point it's too much for the computer to handle to process that much video. Okay. It's north of like 80 hours of video though. It kind of depends on how strong of a computer you're using and some other factors like that. But that's really if you're stitching together the video, right? Mm-hmm. So let me back up a second. I'm going to close this and repeat that process just to show you to answer that question you just asked a little bit differently. So if I go to File, Combine Timeline Movies again, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm going to choose those same individual movie packages, click Combine, and I'm going to call this Combine Timeline no movie. If I check this box that says do not create movie, that will stitch all the timelines together linearly, like you said, but not the movies. Because the movie's really the creates the bottleneck for the computer, right? That's the problematic part. So now if I click save, I can get the database. I can get the combined timeline here, and I can still, for example, open a matrix and look at all the numbers there, right? I can still get a lot of my information, but without the sort of the anvil of the movie that's, very clunky to move around. Does that make sense? That
makes sense. And I'm thinking this is, especially like I've done some analysis of some videos and
oh, I think I lost you, Mary. Did you hit mute maybe? Well, let me know if you come back on or hit unmute. So once you get to a certain point, in terms of how many movies you're stitching together, you could use this combined timelines without movies. It's pretty handy if you have a very large data set. Okay, so I'm going to move on to a feature that is new in version 10, which is really handy if you're collaborating amongst a team of coders. And that's, let me open intersection 1 here. Oh, you know what? Actually, before I move on, let me mention something really important about a combined timeline. So a combined timeline here, even the one with the movie window, right? I could, like I said, double click on an instance, watch an instance, and sorry.
I think it was my internet.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, sorry.
No problem. So I was just about to mention one thing that's really important to keep in mind with a combined timeline, particularly the kind that has a movie window. So, you can watch an instance. I could double click right on a row and watch the movie. And it seems like all the movies here, you can watch it. But what I really want to make clear is that a combined timeline, there's really no movie inside this file. It's actually pulling the movie from the original individual timelines here. Does that make sense? It's kind of like a shortcut where, even though you're watching the movie and doing all those types of things here, the real movies live back in the individual timelines. We do that purposely because then it allows you to create many different combined timelines very quickly without having to use much more space on your computer or re-render the video, which takes a lot of time. But you just have to be aware of the fact that, for example, if you trashed one of these initial movie packages, right, your combined timeline is not going to work. There's a relationship there between the combined and the originals. But it gives you a lot of flexibility because you could create lots of different combined timelines to reflect different subsets of your data set. So just keep that in mind. As opposed to a database, when you create a database, that actually does re-render all the video, and you could trash the initial individual movie packages in that case. All right, so that's a combined timeline. Now I'm going to talk about how to create multiple timelines inside the same movie package, which is really useful for times when possibly multiple coders are coding the same movie, but they don't want to look at each other's coding. You know, they want like a discrete coding environment, maybe to do some blind coding on a movie. So here's that same intersection 1 movie. I can create a new timeline by just clicking on this icon on the timeline itself. And what that does is open a second timeline here. You can see it says intersection 1 copy, and it's blank. So it doesn't have any rows. I'm going to back up and show you a similar feature. Disregard what I'm doing right now. Let's say I actually selected a given row in the timeline, and then I clicked new timeline. It'll take that row into the new timeline if you wanted. And then the point of this feature really is that now that I have this new timeline, I'll go to File, make sure it's the frontmost window there. Then I'm going to go to File, Save. And it's asking me where I want to save just the timeline, not a whole new movie package, but just this timeline. Where do I want to save it? And what's great now, like let's say this is intersection 1, and this is the specific timeline I'm going to code in. I'll just put my name there. And now I have the ability to save it inside the package itself. And that's useful now because let's say if I close this, I'll save that timeline. The main timeline will auto save when I close it. Now when I go back to open that intersection 1 copy, I'm prompted with this little dialog where I can choose the specific timeline that I want to open. So now I could just open that one, code into my own timeline, and not be, you know, distracted or interrupt anyone else's coding in their own timeline. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. That makes sense.
So, you know, theoretically, I would go through and code, and I might, let's say, I look for my own taxis and bicycles, and I'll just doctor these rows because it would probably make sense that I'm going to have, you know, some different sets of codes here, right? Whatever I find might be different than the first person in the first timeline. So typically the thought is now, okay, Justin, I've done my own coding in my own timeline here. I want to get this information back to the main timeline. And so I can start consolidating various coders' information into a single timeline, right? So what I can do is go to File, Export, and actually let me also mention an equally typical use case for what I'm about to show you is if maybe there's a coder at a particular location and then a teammate, you know, lives or works in a different location, and you want to send them their timeline information without having to send the whole movie. So this is commonly used for that purpose too. So if I go to File, Export, XML Edit List, If you don't know what an XML edit list is, don't worry, because it doesn't matter. You're never going to open it. But it's just basically all the information in the timeline, like a list of timestamps and row names and things like that.
Okay.
So maybe I'll call this Justin, so I know it comes from my own timeline. I'll save it to the desktop, right? And remember, I have my specifically named rows here. So let me close this timeline, reopen this, and now I'm imagining that I'm another person, right? And I have this master sort of timeline, intersection one here. And I want to get Justin's coding into my timeline. It's as easy as just going to file import, right? Earlier we went to export, but now we want to import that XML. And notice I'm never even opening this file. It's just a messenger, right? To send that information. So when I click choose, you can see in the timeline, it just dumped those rows right into the same timeline. So this feature, the sending of the exporting and importing of XMLs, works between any timeline in any movie package. It doesn't need to be, like I just demonstrated, timelines inside the same movie package. That makes sense?
That makes sense, yeah.
Now it's really easy. Typically you might do this like sort rows by name, right? And now I can see like, oh, there's taxi, the master row, here's my row. I might import your row and have taxi-Mary, right? It's really easy to see visually where there's some agreement between coders.
I'm just curious whether what you get by doing this exporting and then importing it into this master timeline is the same as like we would code whenever we coded using timelines, we would individually code and then one person would combine the timelines, but we used to combine them by just having all the timelines open, which became a bit crazy, especially when the number of coders increased. So we would the person combining them would open all the timelines and then highlight the timelines that you want to combine from it got quite unwieldy towards the end when there was like 8 of us coding. Is it the same result? Because I'm thinking...
It's the same result. Just for the listeners here, I'll just say that the feature you're talking about, first of all, I can just tell that your team has used Studiocode for a while, because that was sort of the old way to do this. This gives you a little more flexibility. But the feature you're talking about is called merging, as opposed to combining.
Merging as opposed to combining. Okay.
Yeah, they're very similarly named features, but just for sake of argument here, the feature we covered earlier today was combining. That stitches timelines end to end, right? Linearly, like you said, across multiple movie packages.
Yes.
The feature we're talking about now, this XML, or previously used merge timelines, which not many people use anymore, is really to do this sort of it's because you guys are all looking at the same movie file and you need to consolidate the coding into a single timeline.
And so, this definitely works better because you don't have to open the timelines.
Right, you don't have to open the timelines. There's also sort of a secondary benefit that you might imagine. Here, I'll just show you. This should never happen. Oh, oops, what happens if, I don't know, somehow you accidentally delete all your coding? I mean, there's backup files inside the movie package, but what I do is at certain points in my work, I'll just save an XML as a backup outside. So now, for example, if I lost my coding, I know I have this XML where I could just say file import, go get it from that place that I saved it. Does that make sense? This is mine here, and now all the coding just gets dumped right back in. So yeah, it's a nice secondary benefit, but there's there's also backups inside the movie package. But
yes.
Okay. So I think it sounds like your team sits near each other physically. But particularly for those who work in different states, or this gives you a little more flexibility because you don't have to have all the movie packages there at the same time because, sorry, you can just email the XML, right? As long as someone has the movie package, you can just email the XML, which takes up no space at all, and just do the import.
We actually across, I mean, we just have like maybe 3 people in one university, but the work we do is across 3 universities. Yeah, and one is in a different state. One university is in a different state. The other university is 10 hours drive from where I am.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so we actually do a lot of sending the timelines, via email,
I see.
sending it as an attachment. Yeah.
Yeah, so this might give you a little more seamless workflow or save you a couple clicks here and there.
Mm-hmm.
You're already familiar with this, but just for other people listening, it's also important that when you import and export XMLs that, for example, in the example I just used, I gave the row names a specific identifier, like my name at the end. So when I did the import, it didn't overwrite the existing taxi or bus or bicycle row because I had that unique identifier. If I didn't do that and just stuck with the same exact row name, it would just overwrite. Actually, it wouldn't overwrite. It would just add the new information and new instances into the timeline. But just pay attention to row names when you're doing that importing and exporting. The labels don't matter as much. It's really just the code names. Okay, so I think there's one more thing. Let me check my list here. Yeah, so last thing here, let's talk about different platforms that various ways that people can actually share the actual files. Typically, when there's teams of Studiocode users working together, there's 2 primary ways I see people sharing files. One, depending on how large your data set is that everyone has their own duplicate copy of the data set or volume of videos, movie packages, that is, on their own computer or their own external hard drive. That's a common way to just make sure everyone has the same set of files. A different approach is to use a sharing platform like Dropbox or Box and share the files on some platform like that, but not Google Drive. If you use Box or Dropbox, it's important that you install the desktop software, not in a browser. So you can see, for example, if you install Box or Dropbox, it can create a folder in Finder, and then you could interact with movie packages in Finder on the Mac, right? I mean, it's being backed up in the cloud as well, but this way you can share the same data set or set of movie packages between coders without having to necessarily duplicate the volume for everyone. Although there's advantages to both methods, it just depends on what's better for you. If you use a sharing platform like Dropbox or Box, just be sure that if you have a movie package open, somebody else doesn't have the same one open at the same time, because the last person to close it is what the movie package or file will reflect in terms of what's being saved. So usually it's just becomes a communication issue. Like if there's 2 or 3 people working on the same team, usually it's pretty manageable. If there's, a lot of people, it may be better to just duplicate the data set. And then along those lines, I should mention that, right now, whenever you need, you can also export a movie from Studiocode, and then you can import it into Connect here, our cloud product that also allows you to collaborate. So that's another nice solution of sharing movies, and very soon you'll be able to also export the coding and import that into Connect. So, people are starting to use Connect as a platform and a partner with Studiocode for sharing, which is really nice. Okay. Well, thanks for the time today. Appreciate it. And hopefully we'll see you on a future webinar.